4'11" to 5'2", the efficiency survivor. People have been underestimating you your entire life. Not in a rude way, just automatically. But biologically, your body might be built like a survival hybrid engine. At 4'11" to 5'2", your body operates in what evolutionary biology would call low fuel mode. One of the main advantages is energy efficiency. Every body burns energy just to stay alive. Heart beating, lungs moving, temperature regulated. That baseline cost is your basal metabolic rate, and it scales directly with body mass. A smaller frame means lower maintenance. In modern life, that sounds trivial, but in ancestral environments, that efficiency often meant the difference between surviving a famine and not. For most of human history, food wasn't guaranteed. Droughts, failed hunts, poor harvests. Entire populations collapsed when calories disappeared. In those moments, the body that required the least energy to keep functioning had a real advantage. Not the strongest body, the most efficient one. Smaller metabolic needs meant you could simply last longer when supply collapsed. Heat regulation adds another layer. Smaller bodies tend to shed heat more easily relative to their mass. In hot climates, equatorial regions, tropical environments, overheating was a real survival risk. Your proportions helped dump excess heat faster. Larger bodies retained it longer, forcing the system to work harder just to stay stable. Mechanically, shorter limbs also reduce leverage stress on joints. Every step sends impact force through knees, hips, and ankles. Longer limbs amplify that force. Over tens of millions of steps across a lifetime, shorter lever arms mean slightly less cumulative wear. Now the social side. Humans unconsciously associate physical size with threat and confrontation cost. Larger bodies trigger caution. Smaller ones trigger less of it. That's why people may test you faster, interrupt you sooner, or question you more directly. But the same mechanism creates a quieter advantage. When people don't perceive you as threatening, they also lower their guard. They reveal more information, speak more freely, and behave less defensively. What looks like underestimation often functions as social camouflage. Historically, people who couldn't rely on physical intimidation developed influence through different tools: strategy, negotiation, coalition building, and reading social dynamics precisely. Those skills compound over time in ways raw presence never does. Efficiency, endurance, strategic awareness. That's the evolutionary trait this height produced. But the next height starts to introduce something different: social leverage. 5'2" to 5'6", the strategic optimizer. Your height probably never dominates the room, and that places you in one of the most strategically interesting zones in human social dynamics. You're not short enough to be underestimated. You're not tall enough to be automatically deferred to. Welcome to the negotiation zone. At this height, you sit slightly below the global average, but not at an extreme. Your presence rarely triggers strong reactions either way. People don't immediately dismiss you, but they also don't automatically defer to you. The first impression starts neutral, and the next few seconds of behavior determine where it goes. Biologically, this range still carries many of the efficiency advantages of smaller frames. Total body mass remains lower than average, which reduces baseline energy demand. Your basal metabolic rate, the calories burned simply to keep the body functioning, stays relatively efficient compared to larger frames. In nascent environments where food supply fluctuated, bodies that required less energy simply stayed functional longer when resources collapsed. Mechanically, shorter limbs also move through slightly smaller ranges of motion under load. In certain movements, squats, pushes, lifts, that shorter travel distance can create more efficient force production. Acceleration and rotational movement can also feel sharper because limbs complete their arc faster. But the biggest difference at this height is psychological. Because your height doesn't provide a strong authority signal, behavior becomes the deciding variable. Posture, voice tone, pacing, eye contact. Those cues carry disproportionate weight in how people read you. If those signals are controlled and decisive, perception rises quickly. If they're uncertain or inconsistent, perception drops just as fast. That volatility is the defining feature of this height range. Someone extremely tall receives built-in credibility. Someone extremely short carries an obvious underdog frame. You sit between those anchors, which means the room recalibrates based almost entirely on what you do. In other words, your height doesn't decide your status. Your behavior does. But move a little closer to the global average and something interesting happens. Height stops influencing perception almost entirely. 5'7" to 5'8", the behavioral neutral. Nobody has ever commented on your height. Not to admire it. Not to mock it. That's because your brain and everyone else's barely notices it. At this height, you sit extremely close to the global average, which means your height rarely triggers the brain's size detection shortcut. Humans are wired to notice outliers, very tall, very short, very large, because unusual size might signal dominance, threat, or vulnerability. But when a trait sits near the statistical middle, the brain mostly ignores it. Your height doesn't anchor the first impression. That neutrality also has a quiet physical advantage. Most human environments are designed around average body proportions: doorways, furniture, vehicles, tools, workspaces. When your frame sits near those proportions, the physical world tends to fit you without constant adjustment. You aren't regularly crouching, stretching, or compressing your posture just to move through everyday spaces. Individually, those frictions are tiny, but across thousands of daily interactions, they reduce physical strain. Biomechanically, you also sit near the middle of the human leverage spectrum. Your limbs aren't long enough to create the higher joint forces often seen in taller frames, and they're not short enough to create disadvantages in reach-dependent tasks. Instead, you land in a versatility zone. You may not dominate any single physical category, but you avoid most structural penalties as well. Psychologically, neutrality shifts the entire burden of perception onto behavior. Because your height does not supply an automatic authority signal, positive or negative, the room waits for behavioral cues: posture, pacing, decisiveness, tone. Those signals become the primary way people determine status, which creates a simple rule for this height range. Performance defines perception. Nothing structural is helping or hurting you in the initial read. What people conclude about you comes almost entirely from what you do in the first moments of interaction. But move just slightly taller, and biology starts optimizing for something else entirely: longevity. 5'9" to 5'11". The longevity sweet spot. You're not the tallest, not the most imposing, not the most efficient, and that might be exactly the point. Because in evolutionary terms, the goal was never to be impressive. The goal was to survive the longest. This height range sits near what many researchers describe as a biological balance point. You're large enough to maintain strength and physical capability, but not so large that the body begins paying steep long-term maintenance costs. In large population studies tracking health and lifespan, individuals around average height often appear near the lower end of all-cause mortality risk, meaning lower combined risk across cardiovascular disease, cancer, and metabolic illness. Part of that pattern comes down to cell count. Taller bodies contain more total cells, and every time a cell divides, there's a small chance of replication error. Cancer is essentially a copying error that escapes the body's repair systems. More cells dividing across a lifetime simply means more statistical opportunities for something to go wrong. A moderately sized body carries fewer of those chances. Your cardiovascular system also operates under relatively balanced demands. Blood has shorter distances to travel than in very tall frames, which means the heart doesn't need to generate as much pressure to circulate blood through the body. That difference is small per heartbeat, but the heart beats roughly 100,000 times per day. Across decades, lower circulatory strain adds up. Biomechanically, this range also avoids the extremes. Your joints absorb less impact force than those of very tall frames, but your limbs remain long enough to maintain effective leverage and mobility. You land close to the mechanical middle of the human frame. Psychologically, this height also sits in a mostly neutral perception zone. You're close enough to average that height, rarely dominates the first impression. People don't assume authority automatically, but they also don't apply the subtle bias that shorter individuals often face. The result is a range that biology seems to favor for durability, not peak dominance, not maximum efficiency, longevity. But once you move slightly above the average frame, another evolutionary advantage begins to appear. Authority. 5'11" to 6'2", accelerated authority. You've probably been taken seriously before you even said a word. That's because your presence triggers something automatic in the human brain. At this height, you've crossed the threshold where people start registering someone as visibly above average. Humans evolved fast shortcuts for assessing physical capability. Larger bodies historically meant greater reach, strength, and potential threat. So before conscious judgment even begins, the brain often assigns slightly higher credibility or leadership potential to taller individuals. Research repeatedly finds that taller than average people are overrepresented in leadership roles, from corporate executives to political candidates. It's not that height creates competence, it creates perception. And perception shapes who gets listened to, who gets deferred to, and who gets selected when decisions must be made quickly. Physically, this range still captures many advantages of longer limbs without hitting the extreme structural costs seen at greater heights. Longer arms increase reach. Longer legs increase stride length, which can translate into efficiency in activities that reward distance per step. Your frame also provides greater skeletal surface area for muscle attachment, slightly raising the ceiling for absolute strength potential compared to smaller frames. At the same time, the biological trade-offs are still relatively moderate here. The cardiovascular system works slightly harder than in shorter bodies, because blood must travel further, but the circulatory network has not expanded enough to significantly elevate long-term health risks. Joint stress is higher than in smaller frames, yet still within ranges most bodies tolerate well across a lifetime. Psychologically, the biggest shift at this height is expectation. Because people subconsciously associate height with competence and authority, they often assume capability before evidence appears. That creates credibility momentum, but it also raises the standard you're judged against. When behavior aligns with the authority your height suggests, perception compounds quickly. When it doesn't, the mismatch becomes far more visible than it would be for someone whose height created no expectation at all. At this height, credibility often arrives before proof. Presence starts working in your favor. But once the frame grows even larger, authority shifts into something stronger: physical dominance. 6'2" to 6'5", cold adapted power. People tend to give you space before you ask for it. That's because at this height, the human brain registers your presence as physically dominant almost instantly. The brain's threat assessment system processes body size extremely quickly. Throughout human history, larger bodies meant greater reach, strength, and higher confrontation cost. So, before conscious judgment even begins, people often make small behavioral adjustments around you. A little more distance, fewer interruptions, and slightly more hesitation before challenging you. Biologically, your frame now sits in a range where lever mechanics become powerful. Longer arms generate more force at the end of a movement: throwing, pushing, striking. Because longer levers amplify output. Longer legs extend stride length, meaning each step covers more ground. In activities where reach and spatial control matter, this produces real structural advantages. Your skeletal frame also supports greater muscle mass potential. Larger bones provide more surface area for muscle attachment, raising the theoretical ceiling for absolute strength compared with smaller frames. Training still matters, but the architecture underneath it is larger. Thermodynamics adds another evolutionary layer. Larger bodies have a lower surface area to volume ratio, meaning they retain heat more effectively. In cold environments, this becomes a survival advantage because internally generated heat escapes more slowly. Anthropologists have long observed that populations evolving in colder climates tend to develop larger average body sizes, partly for this reason. But the biological costs begin rising here as well. A taller circulatory system means the heart must push blood through longer vessels and against greater gravitational distance. Joint forces increase as limb length increases, so knees, hips, and ankles absorb more impact during ordinary movement. Psychologically, intimidation becomes almost automatic at this height. People challenge you less often, but they also become more cautious in what they say. Deference increases. Openness sometimes decreases. But once the human body grows even taller, power transforms into something different. Not dominance. Presence. 6'5" to 6'11". Maxed out presence. You are almost impossible to ignore. That's because at this height, the human brain instantly registers you as an extreme. Humans are wired to track outliers. When a physical trait sits far outside the average, the brain flags it and stores it more vividly in memory, which means people tend to remember interactions with you more clearly than they would with someone closer to average. Visibility becomes automatic. You don't need to compete for attention the way most people do. Physically, this range pushes human leverage mechanics close to their upper practical limit. Very long limbs dramatically extend reach and stride length. In sports that reward vertical reach or spatial coverage, basketball, volleyball, certain football positions, this frame can produce measurable performance advantages. The skeletal structure also supports very high absolute muscle mass potential, since larger bones provide more attachment area for muscle. But the biological maintenance cost rises sharply. The cardiovascular system must circulate blood through a much larger network of vessels, which increases workload on the heart over time. Joint forces also scale upward. Longer limbs create greater leverage at the moment of impact during walking or running, meaning knees, hips, and ankles absorb higher stress even during normal movement. Energy demand increases as well. Larger bodies require more calories simply to maintain basic biological function. In modern environments, that's manageable. But historically, it would have been expensive during periods of food scarcity. Socially, intimidation effects reach their peak. people challenge you less often, but they also tend to filter themselves more carefully around you. Authority can appear quickly, but the same presence that creates influence can also limit how much honest feedback you receive. Move even further beyond the average human frame, and biology begins approaching its outer boundary, evolution's ceiling. 7 foot and above, evolution's ceiling. At this height, you're no longer just tall, you're a statistical extreme. And when the human body moves that far outside its usual range, evolution starts running into its limits. But before those limits show up, extreme height creates one unusual advantage: apex visibility. In prehistoric groups, someone this tall could see over vegetation, crowds, and movement patterns more easily than almost anyone else. That extra visual range mattered during travel, hunting, or scanning for threats. In open environments, a person who could spot movement earlier effectively became a natural observation tower for the group. Even today, the brain reacts to that visibility instantly. Humans are wired to track statistical outliers. An extreme height sits far outside the normal distribution. When you enter a space, attention shifts automatically. People notice you without trying to. That kind of presence is almost impossible to manufacture. But biologically, the trade-offs increase sharply. The body at this scale is no longer just a larger version of the average frame. Many systems are operating close to their structural limits. The cardiovascular system carries the largest burden. The heart must push blood through an unusually long circulatory network and maintain pressure across a large vertical distance from chest to feet. Over time, that constant demand increases cardiovascular strain. Circulation in the lower extremities also becomes more difficult because gravity is working against a much taller column of blood. Skeletal stress rises sharply as well. The spine, hips, knees, and ankles support much greater compressive and leverage forces during ordinary movement. Even standing or walking generates loads that accumulate wear on joints and connective tissue faster than in smaller frames. Energy demand is also extremely high. Larger bodies require more calories simply to maintain organs, tissue repair, and temperature regulation. In modern environments, that's manageable, but historically it would have been extremely difficult to sustain a body this large during periods of food scarcity. Psychologically, rarity detection reaches its maximum. People don't just notice you, they remember you. Interactions often begin with assumptions about strength, dominance, or capability long before anyone learns anything about you. Extreme height gives you automatic presence. What determines whether that presence becomes an advantage or a burden is everything you build on top of it. And if you want to understand the psychological signals people are reading from you before you even speak, watch the next video.